The Philippine jungle is not just a collection of trees and vines, it is a living, breathing entity that actively tries to consume everything that enters it. It is a green hell of suffocating humidity, rot, and shadows where the sun struggles to touch the ground. For a modern army, it is a nightmare environment where GPS signals bounce off the canopy and radios die in the moisture. But for the United States Marines, who arrived for the annual Balikatan joint military exercises, the jungle was just another problem to be solved with superior technology. They brought with them the pinnacle of modern warfare, thermal imaging. The scenario for the night's exercise was simple on paper but brutal in practice. A platoon of U.S. Marines would establish a defensive perimeter around a high-value target in the middle of the dense forest. Their objective was to hold the line until sunrise. Opposing them was a squad of the Philippines elite Scout Rangers, the Musang or Civet Cats, whose objective was to infiltrate the perimeter and destroy the target. The Americans were confident, and they had every right to be. They were equipped with AN/PS-13 thermal weapon sights and sophisticated night vision goggles that turned the pitch-black jungle into a crisp, glowing green video game. In modern war, you cannot hide from heat. The human body radiates infrared energy like a beacon. To a thermal sensor, a soldier hiding behind a bush glows white-hot against the cool background of the leaves. You can wear camouflage paint to fool the eye, but you cannot stop your heart from pumping warm blood through your veins. The U.S. commander, a battle-hardened lieutenant who had served in the deserts of the Middle East, told his men to trust their glass. "If it breathes, we will see it," he said. They set up their overlapping fields of fire, their electronic eyes scanning the darkness, waiting for the glowing silhouettes of the Filipino soldiers to appear. They waited. And they waited. An hour passed. The jungle was noisy with the sounds of insects and nocturnal birds, a cacophony of shrieks and clicks that can drive a man crazy. On the thermal screens, the Marines saw the heat signatures of monkeys moving in the trees and monitor lizards scuttling on the forest floor. But they saw no humans. The perimeter remained silent. The lieutenant checked his comms, asking his observation posts if they had any movement. "Negative, sir. The screen is clear." The technology was working perfectly. The sensors were picking up the heat of a rat at 50 meters. If a squad of rangers were approaching, they would look like a bonfire. 2 hours passed. The tension began to bleed away, replaced by a creeping sense of confusion. The rangers were famous for their endurance, but they couldn't be invisible. The U.S. Marines began to wonder if the exercise had been delayed, or if the opposing force had gotten lost in the treacherous terrain. The lieutenant scanned the tree line again with his thermal monocular. Nothing but the cool blues and purples of wet vegetation. It was as if the enemy didn't exist. Then, the radio clicked. It wasn't a report from one of the outer sentries. It was a voice from right inside the command tent. "Bang! You are dead." The lieutenant spun around. Standing 3 feet behind him, inside the heart of his secure perimeter, was a figure that looked like a monster risen from the swamp. The man was covered from head to toe in thick, wet mud. Fresh foliage was woven so expertly into his gear that even up close, his outline broke up and merged with the background. He was holding a knife, the blade resting gently against the lieutenant's shoulder armor. Simultaneously, all around the perimeter, the dead silence was broken. U.S. Marines who had been staring intently at their thermal scopes suddenly felt a tap on their shoulder or heard a whisper in their ear. They turned to find Filipino Rangers standing right next to them, grinning through masks of mud. They had walked right past the sensors. They had crawled within inches of the boots of the sentries. The entire defensive line had been compromised, the high-value target destroyed, and not a single shot had been fired. The technology hadn't failed, it had been outsmarted. The debriefing the next morning was a masterclass in humility. The U.S. Marines, stripping off their high-tech gear, gathered around the Scout Rangers, who were washing the mud off their bodies with canteens of water. The American lieutenant asked the question that was on everyone's mind, "How did you beat the thermals?" "We were watching every inch of that ground." The Filipino squad leader, a sergeant with the calm demeanor of a man who had spent more nights sleeping on roots than in a bed, explained the method. It wasn't magic, it was physics and misery. He explained that the Rangers knew exactly how thermal optics worked. They knew the sensors looked for the contrast between body heat and the environment. So, they decided to become the environment. Before the mission started, the Rangers had stripped down and covered their uniforms and skin in a thick layer of heavy, wet river mud. The mud did two things. It broke up their visual silhouette for regular night vision, but more importantly, the water content in the mud acted as an insulator. It trapped their body heat, preventing it from radiating outward. For a short period, the mud cooled their exterior temperature to match the ambient temperature of the jungle floor. But mud alone wasn't enough. As the mud dried, it would crack and heat up. So, the Rangers moved with a discipline that bordered on the superhuman. They utilized a technique called the slow walk. They didn't run, they flowed. They moved inches at a time, keeping their heart rates drastically low to minimize metabolic heat output. They crawled on their bellies through the rotting vegetation, pressing their bodies into the cool, damp earth, letting the jungle absorb their warmth. When they saw the U.S. Marines scanning with thermals, the Rangers didn't hide behind trees, they hid in the ground. They knew that thermal sights have a hard time distinguishing depth when the temperature is uniform. By pressing flat against the cool mud and moving only when the wind blew the branches to mask their motion, they became thermal ghosts. They were looking at the Marines through the gaps in the ferns, watching the Americans stare at their screens, blind to the threat crawling 10 feet in front of them. One U.S. Marine shook his head in disbelief. "I was looking right at you," he said to a Ranger. "My screen showed nothing." The Ranger smiled and pointed to the ground. "You were looking for a soldier," he said. "I was a rock." This exercise highlighted a critical difference in doctrine. The U.S. military doctrine relies heavily on overmatch, using superior firepower and technology to dominate the battle space. The Filipino doctrine, forged in decades of insurgency warfare against rebels in the dense jungles of Mindanao, relies on asymmetry, using the environment to negate the enemy's advantages. The Rangers couldn't afford thermal sights, so they learned how to defeat them. They couldn't afford to call in airstrikes, so they learned how to get close enough to use a knife. The Balikatan exercise ended with a swapping of patches, a tradition among warriors. The U.S. Marines traded their Velcro flags for the Scout Ranger tabs. The respect was mutual and profound. The Americans taught the Filipinos about coordinated drone strikes and satellite communications. In return, the Filipinos taught the Americans how to disappear. They taught them that technology is a tool, not a crutch. A thermal sight needs batteries, a Ranger needs only resolve. A GPS needs a satellite signal, a Ranger needs only the stars. The lesson of that humid night was etched into the minds of every soldier present. You can have millions of dollars of equipment, you can own the skies and the airwaves, but when you step into the jungle, you are entering the domain of the Musang. And in the jungle, the eyes that see everything are not the digital ones. They are the ones covered in mud, waiting in the dark. As the sun rose over the canopy, steaming the moisture off the leaves, the ghosts put their uniforms back on. They were no longer invisible monsters. They were just men, laughing and sharing cigarettes with their American counterparts. But the memory of that tap on the shoulder would remain. It was a silent reminder that in the age of artificial intelligence and infrared sensors, the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is still the human instinct to survive, adapt, and overcome. The thermal screens had shown an empty jungle, but the Rangers proved that the jungle is never truly empty. It is always watching.